Alright guys, so the economic war is going global and this is your financial Armageddon update, and we have said this multiple times before. The US is becoming protectionist not just against China. The game plan is to protect their economy from global exports, make imports coming to the US so expensive that consumers would rather buy stuff made in America, and Trump is blazing at the world now. He's planning to slap an additional 10% tariff on Chinese goods. Trump's also going to punish Mexico and Canada. A 25% tariff could be coming for these two countries, which is really wow. It proves the point once again that no country in the world is safe. You might be next. Almost immediately, the dollar flew up, and currencies, including the Mexican peso and the Canadian dollar, fell. This introduces a new risk of inflation for all these economies. Within a span of just hours, the Mexican peso plunged by nearly a full percentage point. This is a warning of how tariffs can destroy a currency. If Mexico exports less to the US, they would earn fewer dollars, plus the demand for their local currency also drops. It's important we realize the agenda of Trump. He has said it multiple times. He has vowed tariffs throughout the entire campaign trail.
I will pass the Trump Reciprocal Trade Act. If China or any country makes us pay a 100 or 200% tariff, we will make them pay a reciprocal tariff of 100 or 200% right back. In other words, if you screw us, we will then screw you. It's very easy. It's very simple.
Now, is Trump using this as a negotiation tactic? Maybe, or he could be really serious about imposing tariffs that stay indefinitely. The US has a new game plan going forward into 2025, and it revolves around bringing manufacturing back. The simplest strategy is to drive the cost up for all your other competitors' imports. Make it so expensive to buy stuff from Mexico or China that US consumers would rather buy local products. US manufacturing activity has been contracting for 7 straight months. In fact, the decline has gotten worse since 2022. Higher rates and higher energy prices have made it expensive to produce anything in the US. Consumers are buying cheaper products around the world. So tariffs is a stopgap measure to force people to shop local. And this might just be the ultimate agenda of the tariff plan. China, Canada, and Mexico, these are some of the biggest exporters of goods to the US, which means the repercussions for these countries could be enormous. These three countries account for over 40% of US trade, $600 billion with China, and well past $700 billion for Canada and Mexico each. The US runs a very big trade deficit. They are importing far more than what they export out, especially when it comes to China. So punishing exports can damage a country's GDP significantly. But let's talk about Canada first. They export a ton of goods to the US. American companies have big factories in Ontario, and a 25% tariff will decimate their margins. Just like the US, Canada's industries are not as competitive as China. So trying to divert their exports away from the US to find eager buyers isn't going to be easy. The leader of the opposition in Canada is ringing the alarm bells. Canada is facing one of their biggest challenges, and it's coming from their strongest ally.
President Trump yesterday made an unjustified threat of a 25% tariff on our already weak and shrinking economy. Justin Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland were surprised. 20 days ago, Chrystia Freeland said, "Don't worry, Canada will be fine." Apparently, neither she nor Justin Trudeau were following what the incoming president was saying. Our economy is teetering on the brink of collapse, and now we face this renewed threat.
If Trump imposes his tariffs, Canada's two biggest industries will be clobbered. We are talking about massive layoffs and a collapse in GDP. Trump's agenda is about bringing car factories back to the US. In addition, he also wants to drive demand up for US oil companies. Canada exported over $170 billion in energy to the US. Vehicles came in at nearly $81 billion, and let's not forget consumer goods like maple syrup, that accounts for $63 billion as well. Other industries with extremely tight margins are on the list. chemicals, metals, and paper. These are heavy imports that make money through economies of scale. You have to sell them in bulk. Slapping a 25% tariff on these imports is brutal. Now, firstly, the car business isn't easy. Canada is competing with US car companies on American soil, and they can forget about competing with China. The tariff could force brands like Ford to relocate production from Canada back home to the US, and that could cripple the Canadian auto industry. A ton of jobs would be lost. However, the real damage will be done to Canadian oil exports. A big tariff on oil entering the US from Canada would be a tremendous hit. Listen to this: 97% of Canadian crude oil is sold to the United States. Only 3% were shipped to other places, including the EU and Asia. The profit margins for crude are razor thin. If the US can ramp up production fast enough, suddenly there will be a glut of Canadian oil in the domestic market. Prices will come down, revenue will get clobbered, and Canadian oil giants will face collapsing profits. The situation isn't great here. If all goes to plan, the US could become even more self-sufficient under Trump. He'll give permits for even more fracking and unleash US energy. Then Canada will be in a world of trouble. But let's shift focus to China and Mexico. Both of these economies are extremely connected when it comes to the topic of tariffs. Firstly, China is going to face an additional 10% tax. This is the current list of tariff increases China is facing from Joe Biden. 100% for EVs, 50% for solar and semiconductors, and 25% for almost everything else. Now you slap an additional 10% on these figures. Trump basically announced to the world that the US is decoupling from China. This is going to impact China adversely in the short term. And that's why when you look at the stock market, the Hang Seng Index, the Shanghai Index, they're all coming down, and why the Chinese government is planning a big stimulus package. They have to replace US demand with local people, but this will take quite some time to accomplish. In Mexico's case, Trump wants a trade war as well, and the Mexicans are hinting that they might just retaliate. They are drawing the red line. According to Mexico, one tariff will be followed by another in response. Common companies will be at risk. They also made a very good point. The main exporters from Mexico to the US are General Motors, Stellantis, and Ford Motor Company. Punishing Mexico could mean hurting your own US auto brands. But if we look through another lens, Trump's trade war makes sense. He simply wants to bring manufacturing back to US soil. For GM and Ford to manufacture stuff mainly in the US, to relocate jobs back to the American people. Now, the reasons to punish Mexico is to curb the flow of migrants. That's at least what he said. But I argue that it's more to do with Mexico's trade relations with China. In 2023, Mexico surpassed China to become the biggest exporter of goods to the US. So it looks like business is booming. However, that's only one side of the equation. China is building a ton of factories in Mexican cities to ship goods into the US, and that helps to bypass trade barriers to US consumers. It's no accident that Mexico is the target of Trump's trade war. Since 2020, Chinese trade with Mexico has been rising fast, from $60 billion to over $100 billion last year. Sure, some of them could be EVs into the Mexican market, but there are a ton of electronics and machinery that transits from Mexico into the US. Trump wants to close that loophole. It could be a case where he wants Mexico to ditch Chinese companies to avoid the 25% tariff. Now, there's probably some cloak and daggers going on, secret discussions behind the scenes. Stop helping China and we will drop the barriers. So, tariffs sound great, they sound strong, but beware of the blowback effects. There's cause and effect to consider. When Trump imposes tariffs, it's not China or Mexico paying the taxes. It's US consumers who will be footing the bill. The Peterson Institute found that the tariff plan has a fatal flaw. The price of imports will all go up, especially when you want to punish Mexico, Canada, and China all at the same time. For a 10% tariff across the board, we could see a 10% increase in the average import price. So your groceries and staples at Walmart could rise significantly. For a 60% tariff on China's trade war goods, this could increase prices by a crazy 44%. And this goes up to 60% if Trump decides to target all Chinese goods. Suddenly, iPhones will cost more, the clothes on your back will cost more, virtually the cost of everything will skyrocket. The sum of all these tariffs will result in extra costs equivalent to nearly 2% of US GDP. So consumers will be paying more for the same stuff and the economy as a whole will suffer. What happens when you get higher inflation? Well, rates have to stay higher for longer, which isn't good for the US economy. Mortgages will stay expensive, food prices will go up, everything from toiletries to car payments will increase. Even Mexico is warning Trump against a trade war. 400,000 US jobs could be lost. Mexico could fight back with their own set of tariffs. Pickup trucks, for example, which are manufactured in Mexico, will increase by $3,000 if Trump goes ahead. And that's just one instance of the chaos. The short to medium term effect is higher inflation, and there's no going around that because the US imports the majority of stuff from the world. Even if Trump's plan to reshore production works, that's a big if, it's gonna take years or even a decade. Until then, the standard of living will drop. The tariffs are going to hit the living standards of everyone. The bottom 20% of people will suffer the most, a negative 4% hit to their income. Even the top 1% could take a 90 basis points hit as well. And this will be tragic for people, and in the grand scheme of things, consumption within the US itself could drop. Just because you make stuff domestically doesn't mean people are forced to buy it. They could simply cut back on their spending. It's an obvious solution that isn't factored in just yet. The US is a consumption based economy. 70% of GDP, 70%, comes from domestic spending itself. It's really odd because few people are factoring in the risk of retaliation. Mexico has given their warning, and we all know China will retaliate back, and even Canada could hit back as well. Even without a retaliation, the picture isn't pretty. GDP could fall by 0.4%, wages could be flat, and there will also be an employment crisis. The US could lose over 300,000 full-time jobs. And if you think people aren't spending now, just wait until unemployment flies up. In a worst case scenario, this could even trigger an economic recession. So Trump's strategy is a risky one. On one hand, this might be a negotiating tactic to get countries to drop all their trade barriers. But if it's not, if he really wants to go all out, the economy will be at risk. So will this move manufacturing back home? Maybe it will, but it's still a big gamble. Other countries would most definitely retaliate. But let me know what you think. Will Trump's tariffs work? Will Mexico, China, and Canada retaliate back? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.